To me, anything worth doing is worth doing well whenever you possibly can. When it comes to fantasy football drafting, every year I'm always in a league where one or two people are sitting there and bitching about, if I would have known this, I would have done this. If I'd have known that, I would have done that. Well, shame on you. There's no excuse. Failing to prepare is preparing to fail. And if you didn't take the time to prepare yourself, then shame on you. Don't be surprised when your fantasy football team stinks up the freaking joint and everybody makes fun of you and your lousy ass last place team. That's why I'm doing this whole fantasy football draft tips series. And today I want to talk to you about the importance of checking your league settings before the draft. It doesn't take much effort or time, but I promise you, if you check out your league settings before the draft, the payoff could be tremendous. So here's some of the league settings that I think you should know before you do your fantasy football draft. The first thing you need to know is the total number of teams in the league. Is it 8, 10, 12, 14, 16? This is important because you need to be able to go through different scenarios of what players could potentially be available at which picks. Well, if you don't know how many teams are in the damn league and you don't know where you could potentially be picking in each round, you have no clue going into it what you're going to be able to do or not do. Good fantasy football players and great fantasy football drafters not only draft with the regular season in mind, they always will have an eye towards the playoffs. So you need to make sure you know your league's playoff settings. How many teams get into the playoffs? How do you get into the playoffs? What weeks are the playoffs? You need to know this information because if you've got this star running back that you're considering taking, but he's got a devilish schedule weeks 14, 15, and 16, and those are the 3 weeks of your league's fantasy playoffs, maybe you need to go in a different direction and take a running back that has a softer schedule towards that critical time of the fantasy season. You need to know the total number of roster spots and the total number of starting positions. This lets you know how many rounds of draft there's going to be. This lets you know how many bench positions you're going to have. And this lets you know where to prioritize picking what players and what positions in what rounds. Not only do you need to know the total number of roster spots and total number of starting positions, you need to know what those starting positions are. This is one of the biggest gripes I see every year in fantasy football league drafts. Well, if I would have known there were this many flex players, I would have changed my draft strategy. If I would have known there were individual defensive players or 2 team defenses or 2 kickers starting or 2 quarterbacks starting, I would have changed my strategy. Well, shame on you for not doing the easy research ahead of time to know that that might need to be in your consideration when setting up your draft game plan. You need to know how many starting positions or what starting positions there are in order to be able to construct a solid draft game plan. Definitely need to know your league scoring settings. If anything else, you need to know how points are earned, where they're earned, when they're earned, why they're earned. If you're sitting there and taking running back in the first 2 rounds, but it's a PPR league and your wide receivers are going to score more than those running backs that you took, then why not take those wide receivers? If it's a league where the quarterbacks score the most, then maybe you need to prioritize that quarterback position a little bit more. Again, I emphasize, you need to know how you're going to get your points in order to effectively cultivate a proper draft strategy. Rare is the team that is drafted and stays together all fantasy football season long and goes on to win a fantasy league championship. It's just so incredibly rare. You have so many variables, players getting benched, players getting injured, players stepping up and taking over the spot, or whatever the case might be. The bottom line is, you know, at some point in time, you didn't draft the perfect team, no matter how much you try to convince yourself you did right after the draft. You know you're going to have to make some moves. So you need to know how those moves can be made and when and where and why and how and all that stuff. You need to know your league's trade process. You need to know your league's trade deadline. You need to know when you might need to make that big move. You need to know how the waiver wire and free agent process works in your league, because I guarantee you at some point in time, whether it's to cover injuries or cover bye weeks, you're going to need to make waiver moves. You're going to need to add some free agents. You're going to sit there and maybe even need to make a potential trade or 2. So why not make sure you know ahead of time how that process is ultimately going to work? Failing to prepare is preparing to fail. And there's perhaps nothing easier to do to help yourself prepare to have a successful fantasy draft and fantasy season than making sure you check out your damn league settings. It's easy to do. It doesn't take that long to do. Ding dong, dumb dicks. If you want to sit there and have a successful fantasy season, check out your damn league settings before the draft.